right, this video is for second half of Module 16. We're talking about consumer spending. So far we've talked about the multiplier and how the multiplier will definitely impact how much an increase in disposable income will actually impact the GDP. But now we're going to be adding a little bit more to it, and a little bit more of a component to it. So the first thing is that we're going to talk about is something called the consumption function. And yes, I know it has remnants of Schoolhouse Rock, which is not consumption function, it's the conjunction function, but yeah. So that if you get this eerie vibe that you heard this before, no, that's Schoolhouse Rock. So the consumption function shows the relationship between spending and disposable income. So in other words, of the amount of spending that amount of income that we have, how much of it we are actually going to spend. So this sounds like, okay, well, that's very similar to what we talked about in the last video when we talked about the multiplier, in that the idea that some of our disposable income will be spent and some of it will be saved. However, what we did not talk about in the last video, however, was that sometimes we also have money that we spend irregardless of if we have a job. So think about it. Even if you don't have a job and you don't have income, you still have expenses. Why? Well, you have to live, don't you? So you have to pay for food and rent and possibly clothing. So even if you don't have a job, you have to pay for those things. So where do you get the money for that? Well, it could be from loans, it could be from savings, it could be from investments, welfare, could be from good old mom and dad. But the first part about this is something called the autonomous consumer spending, which is the amount that people would spend even without any income. So like I said, is that even if you don't have an income, you still have expenses that you have to pay for. So you may have to dip into your savings, or you may have to get a loan to be able to pay for that stuff. So the autonomous consumer spending tells you how much people would actually spend even without income. So now when we talk about how much totally is spent by somebody, or totally spent by consumers, we have to actually figure it out by this consumer spending is C, which is A, which is our autonomous consumer spending, plus the MPC multiplied by the disposable income. So this should be added to your equation section of your notebook. So C equals A plus MPC times YD. And by the way, I need to fix that. That should be a lowercase y, because remember, capital Y is for GDP. Lowercase y means income. So we're talking here about being able to calculate how much is actually going to be spent by consumers. Now, when we talk about the consumption function, we're actually looking at a graph. So if you look at this graph here to the right, you will see that the disposable personal income is on the x-axis, and the consumption per period is on the y-axis. What the heck does that mean? Well, what this means is this is how much income I have, so 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, and how much of that I'm actually going to spend. So as you can tell, as we increase the income, so for example 500 or 1,000, our spending also increases. That makes sense, okay? But notice that the consumption function does not start out at 0. Why? We just talked about that even when your income is 0, you still have expenses. So the consumption function will always start above 0 at some point, which is going to be our autonomous consumer spending. Okay, so wherever it intersects the y-axis, that's our autonomous consumer spending. That's going to be how much we are going to actually spend, even if we have absolutely no income. So the other thing you can tell is going to be the slope of our line. Remember from geometry or some math classes here that in order to figure out the slope of the line, you're going to be the rise over the run. So the rise is going to be how much our spending changes. So that's the change in C. How much our spending changes divided by YD, which is how much our income has changed. So think about that. Change in spending divided by change in income. Where does that sound familiar? Because that's our marginal propensity to consume. So when we figure out the slope of the line, that also tells us our marginal propensity to consume, or our MPC. Okay, so this consumption function gives us a lot of information. Now, sometimes our consumption function can change. So what causes the changes in consumption function? Now, first of all, I did want to show you this, panel A and panel B. So the panel A is looking at how our consumption function can actually increase. So an increase is going to be moving it up. And it makes sense because if you look at it, at any one particular income, something caused all of a sudden that our spending is increasing. Or on the right side, this is a decrease in our consumption function. So at any particular income, our spending is going to decrease. Well, what causes that to happen? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, it's going to be caused by an increase in disposable income. So think about it this way. Our increases in disposable income. If we're expecting that in the future something's going to happen and all of a sudden we're going to have more money, okay, that will definitely affect how we're spending today. For example, let's fast forward a few years and you graduated college. Yay! Now you're looking for a real job, right? So now you get a job, you go in interviews, you get offered a job, it starts in 2 weeks. Why are you going to spend more now? Well, because you have expenses that you have to pay for. Maybe, for example, you don't have any professional attire, so you need to go buy a whole new wardrobe to be able to wear to work, right? Maybe there's some other things that you're going to need that the workplace does not provide to you. Or maybe simply you're going to treat yourself saying, yes, I got a job, I'm going to celebrate, I'm going to go out and, go out to a nice dinner and show. Anytime you're expecting future income to increase, that's going to definitely increase your spending. A rise in aggregate wealth. Rise in aggregate wealth is going to be referring to not our income, anything other than our income. So this is going to be things like, for example, assets we have. So stocks, bonds, things like your house. Okay, if you own your house, anything that has value. So if there's a rise in aggregate wealth, that means that, for example, maybe your house is worth more, okay? Then you're going to feel like you have more money, so you're going to spend more. The last one is a decrease in the interest rate. And the reason this causes a rise in the spending is because the interest rate is referring to the interest rate on things like loans. So think about it this way. If the interest rate is lower, okay, so that means it's cheaper to get a loan, what happens to the number of loans that are being given out? It's going to increase. More people are going to say, hey, it's a cheap loan rate. I'm going to go get myself a loan. So then as a result, there's going to be a lot more spending. Okay, so for example, things like jobs, increasing the amount of jobs out there, that's definitely going to increase the spending if you're expecting a new job. If your, for example, assets are going to increase in value, so if you have investments, that's going to increase your consumption function. Or if the interest rate changes, that will also increase your consumption function if your interest rate goes down. So the opposite is also true. So if there's expected decreases in disposable income in the future, if, for example, you were told that your company is closing and moving to Mexico, that would definitely be a decrease in spending now. If you know that you're not going to have a job as of April 1st, well, heck, I'm going to start saving now. That's going to be a decrease in consumption function. A decline in aggregate wealth, if the value of some of my assets goes down and all of a sudden my house is worth less, it's definitely going to decrease my consumption function. And then lastly, if there's an increase in the interest rate. So if it costs me more to get a loan, no, I'm not getting a loan. So I'm going to definitely go and spend less. Okay, so let's see how you did. So try this, and I had the people do this in class as a group. So answer these two questions for me. Number one, if MPC is 0.5, disposable income is 30,000, and autonomous consumer spending is 10,000, how much is consumer spending? And then number two, what happens to spending in each case? A, the stock market slumps. B, people are concerned about job security in the future. C, interest rate decreases, or D, the price level falls. So pause the video right here, see if you can figure this out, and then replay once you have your answers. All right, hopefully you gave it a shot. So for the first one, we have to remember that this is our equation. Consumer spending is equal to the autonomous consumer spending plus the marginal propensity to consume times our disposable income. So plugging in our information into this equation, we're going to get $10,000 is our autonomous consumer spending, 0.5 is our MPC, and our disposable income is $30,000. So if you do your math, 30,000 times 0.5 is 15,000. 15,000 plus 10,000 will give you $25,000. Number 2 says what happens to spending in each case. If the stock market has a slump, what happens to spending? Spending will definitely decrease because the value of my assets has dropped. If B says the people are concerned about job security in the future, well, geez, then I'm going to definitely save some money now, so I'm not going to spend now. So it's going to be decrease in spending. C, if the interest rate decreases, again, that's going to be related to our loan. So if it's cheaper to get a loan, yep, I'm going to get a bunch more loans. So it's going to increase the spending. And D, if the price level falls. If things as a whole are cheaper, well, then yeah, I'm going to go spend some money. So it's going to increase spending. How'd you do? Hopefully well. Let me know if you have any questions about those. All right, the last part that I wanted to talk about in this video is investment spending. Now, I wanted to remind you, and this is what I reminded the class about because I saw some problems on the quiz that we had over the last chapter when we talked about investment spending. Investment spending, remember, is going to be any time for a business that we are going to be buying something, a product, a machine that is going to help with producing that product in the future. So, for example, if we're talking about Chatard, okay, so Chatard is a business. So what would be an example of investment spending for Chatard? Well, for example, we have iPads, okay? This year, what iPads would be counted as investment spending? Would the senior iPads be counted as investment spending? No, because they're not new. You already had them. We bought them new 4 years ago when you got them brand new. So the only iPads are going to be counted as investment spending for Chatard this year are the freshman iPads and transfer students because they're the ones that are brand new. Other example, Chatard wants to go and expand and make a connector building in between the main building and the SBC. When they do that, is that considered investment spending? Yes, it is. So they are building that building in there, and that would be considered investment spending as well because it's going to increase how many students they can actually educate. Okay, so remember, investment spending is including those things that we are purchasing to be new to be able to make our product. However, if we're talking about, for example, my projector, okay, my projector in my room, it's old, maybe it needs some maintenance and updates and, maybe some general cleaning. The general cleaning and the updates that they do to my projector is not counted as investment spending because that projector already existed. It's already there. It's not anything new. It's not investment spending. Hopefully that clarified a few things. Okay, so planned investment spending may change for a couple of reasons. So what we have planned for the future as a business may change, first of all, because of, so that's my picture of investment spending, by the way. So this guy standing looking out at the factory and all the lovely factory space and machinery and all that fun stuff. So first of all, interest rates. If the interest rate increases, that's going to cause less investment spending. Why? Well, think about it just like we talked about with consumers. If the interest rate goes up, it means that it's going to cost them more to be able to actually get a loan. If it costs them more to get a loan, they're not going to go and get as many loans, so as a result, they're not going to go in and spend as much. Okay? The opposite is also true. As the interest rate goes down, then investment spending is going to increase because interest rate goes down, it costs less to get a loan. Well, heck yeah, I'll get a loan to be able to expand my factory. Sure, that works for me. That's how interest rate affects investment spending. Second thing that causes a change in investment spending is the expected future sales or the growth rate of GDP. Are companies expecting that GDP is going to go up or that GDP is going to go down? If they think that future sales are going to go up, in other words, GDP is going to go up, then what do you suppose is going to happen to investment spending? Well, hopefully you said it would increase because what happens is that they're expecting that there's going to be more sales in the future. We need to invest now to be able to prepare for that. Case in point of, like I said, Chatard. If we know that there are going to be more students at Chatard in the near future, okay, build it and they will come. That's the mantra here. We have to build more, we have to prepare more for those future sales. And so we have to get that ready to be able to be ready for future sales. All right, the last part that has to do with investment spending is changes in the investment inventory. So if you've ever been in a job that takes inventory, they make you take inventory. What is inventory? Inventory is basically going and counting how much do they actually have. So I have this stereotypical picture of a warehouse here, but you know, counting how many, I don't even know what these boxes are representing, but how many of these do we actually have? Okay, so what happens is that there's planned investment inventory and there's unplanned investment inventory. What that means is that, okay, we have this inventory, this stock, right? So maybe if we're talking about pop, right? And so we're talking about this warehouse full of pop. And we're expecting to sell so much pop. So they have a whole bunch out there. That's the planned investment spending. So this is how much we're planning on selling. What if all of a sudden, for some reason, there's a huge increase in the amount that people are actually buying? What if we way underestimated how much we need? Well, then what happens is that we have what we call unplanned inventory. Unplanned inventory investment is going to be where we sell way more than we actually have. How is that possible? Well, we could go and, for example, dip into other stores' stock. We could go and make more, right? We could have some stuff that's, you know, sells online, whatever. But if we have unplanned inventory investment, what that means is that we way underestimated how much we're actually going to sell. And so as a result, our investment inventory is actually negative because we ran out, right? But if our inventory is way high, we overestimated how much we would actually need. So we have all this pop that's just sitting there. It's not selling. Okay? What happens to our investment spending in the future? Our investment spending in the future is going to drop. We're not going to spend as much because we already have all of this stock. We don't want to make any more because then we'll have more sitting around that we can't sell. So as the stockpile in the inventory increases, investment spending will decrease, and vice versa. And then actual investment is going to be the planned planned inventory plus the unplanned inventory. And so it's going to be whatever we have planned plus whatever we didn't know was going to happen. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in class.